Thank you very much and welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Luke Allen. Dr. Allen works for the WHO headquarters as a global health policy analyst. He also works part-time as a GP and as a research fellow at Oxford's Department of Primary Care. Alongside these roles, he sits on the board of the British Journal of General Practice and the Royal College of General Practice Thames Valley facility. He has over 50 peer-reviewed publications in diverse and highly prestigious journals, including the BMJ and the Lancet, and his writing is also featured in other outlets, including The Economist, The New Scientist, and The Independent. So welcome, Luke, and thank you very much for presenting for us here today. And over to you to talk us through the political economy of global tobacco, alcohol, and junk food consumption.
Thank you very much, Pepita, and it is my very great pleasure to be speaking with you all today. Just before I came on, we were saying that for every 10 of these talks that I sign up to, I probably attend about one. So it's great that we've already got just over 10% of people who signed up. I'm going to jump straight in to this talk. So let's go. What are we going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about and then responding to in questions? Well, we're going to be looking broadly at global health, what's killing us and why, followed by what's happening with NCD deaths, what's happening with the risk factors, tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthy foods, the commercial determinants of NCDs, as we call them. How can we stop overconsumption, and should we? And before I go on any further, I'm just going to see if I can pin my video so I can see if I go anywhere funny up here on Zoom. There we go, that's much better. So without further ado, what's killing us? I've got a graph here of the percentage of total deaths up the side and some different causes along the bottom. And I'd like you to try and guess now which is the highest and which is the lowest. So wars, HIV, cancer, childbirth, dementia, heart attacks, lung infections, malaria, traffic, and undernutrition. We've got 3, 2, 1, and here we go. So cancer and heart attacks by a long way. Obviously, this isn't all deaths in the world, but those two non-communicable, non-infectious diseases killing far more people than war or malnutrition or other causes. And that's been the trend of the last 20, if not the last 2,000 years. So in the WHO, we tend to break diseases into 3 groups. And can you see my mouse along the top if I'm using it to highlight things? Somebody?
Yes.
Great. So at the top, we've got injuries, pretty static at 10% of all deaths in the world. And then we've got non-communicable diseases, which are rising over time. This is anything that isn't this group. Communicable, so infectious diseases like pneumonia or coronavirus, maternal and neonatal deaths, that's deaths in childbirth and the first few years of life, and nutritional diseases, so in the past mainly undernutrition, now increasingly overnutrition, although if you die from obesity-related things, it pops down here. Why has there been this change over time? Why are we seeing an increase in the proportion of deaths due to non-infectious things? Well, there are 3 main reasons. The first is that we've got much better at tackling the infectious causes and maternal deaths. So that's through things like soap, which first got me into public health, realizing how many lives you can save just by getting soap into people's hands. Clean birth kits, immunizations, obviously hot in the press at the moment, sewerage and toilets, really simple things like that, and clean water. So these simple interventions over the past 100 years have been responsible for a precipitous fall in death rates around the world and a pretty meteoric rise in life expectancy around the world. The second cause for the rise in NCDs, which is what's left once you've dealt with these things, is development. Now, I don't know where you stand on capitalism, but it's been unequivocally good for life expectancy. The biggest poverty reduction that the world's ever seen was the 800 million people who fell out of poverty as China's markets first opened up. And if we think about global GDP since the first ever Christmas, really since the Industrial Revolution, it's gone through the roof. And we've seen a great kind of rise in living standards around the world. Of course, there's also been massive problems with pollution, unsustainability and inequalities, but we might touch on those later. For now, the focus really is on extreme poverty. And as that falls, diseases of hunger and infections tend to fall away. What's been really remarkable is the fact that those living in extreme poverty, the number has fallen even as the global population has risen dramatically. It's absolutely incredible, isn't it? This this pink wedge here has been falling away, even as the global population has been surging up. The third reason that NCDs have been on the rise is the environment's changed around us. Really, in the past few years, the world that humans inhabit has changed absolutely radically. And I'd like to just take diet as a brief example to look back at our evolutionary biology. The world's not always looked like this. Hominids have been around for about 2.5 million years. That's kind of bipedal great apes. And Homo sapiens have been around for the past 200,000. I always think it's remarkable that we shared the earth with these other hominid groups, but we seem to have wiped the last of them out about 28,000 years. Anyway, for most of the 200,000 years that we've been around, life has looked like this. And our bodies have evolved and perfectly adapted for life on the Great Plains, where we were hunter-gatherers. So our bodies have grown so that we can be upright, so we can see quite far and spend most of the day running around chasing things and eating almost exclusively vegetables, fruits and nuts with the occasional bit of meat, virtually no sugar, and fat was really scarce. So our bodies have been programmed to really seek out and eat fat and sugar whenever we come across it because it's so rare. About 10,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. I absolutely love this cave painting. It's incredible, isn't it? That was the Neolithic Revolution, where we moved from being primarily hunter-gatherers to discovering agriculture, and most people spent their life in fields. We had another revolution about 200 years ago, where transport began to change for good. People moved into crowded, congested, dirty, smelly, polluted cities and spent more of their time sat down, so less physical activity. The third wave, the technological revolution about 50 years ago, has meant that we can now conduct pretty much our entire day just from our sofa. And I wonder what proportion of you have not actually left the house today, but have still managed to catch up with friends, do most of your work, order your food, go shopping, do your Christmas present stuff. You don't actually have to leave the sofa, do you? So in sum, the question, what's for lunch today, has gone from this to this. And our bodies are just not designed to cope with the surfeit of unhealthy commodities around us. We are fish out of water, and it is unsurprising that we're living with unprecedented rates of childhood obesity. We've never had this much alcohol available to us or easy to buy, and about 10% of people who use alcohol become addicted to it. And tobaccos come from virtually nowhere to be almost universally available, and of course it's highly addictive as well. My first international health degree was in 2007, 2008. And at the time, globalisation was really blamed for the way that the world's changed and the rise in NCDs. At the time, it was defined as the movement of goods and people and ideas around the world at an increasing rate with reducing friction, which is a pretty good definition, isn't it? And it seems to bear out. We've seen cigarettes available everywhere, global brands wherever you travel on Earth, Heineken coming to dominate Africa, unhealthy processed foods all over the place, and cigarettes being sold outside schools. And this is incredible as well. This is a barge, and it's a mobile supermarket sponsored by Nestle that sells junk food and goes and finds hard to reach populations up the Para and Xingu rivers in Brazil. So these populations don't have access to the internet or to healthcare, but they can buy Coca-Cola. It turns out that 2007 was a bit of an inflection point. Global trade really began to stall. 2008, we had the crash. But even before then, the amount of product being sold around the world changed. Poorer countries were still buying soft drinks and tobacco, but the change in sales volumes around the rich world began to stall. This pattern is similar, but a bit attenuated for alcohol. If we look at foreign direct investment and exports of goods and services, we can see again that 2007 really reflected the apotheosis of globalisation, and global trade's been stalling ever since. Now that was 13 years ago, and in recent years we've seen another two major challenges. The first of which is he who shall not be named, who's definitely erected some borders to the flow of goods and people around the world. And then the last year, it that shall not be named, if I can help it in this talk, which has seen massive restrictions, obviously, to international flows. But these two events exacerbated rather than precipitated the decline in globalization. And if you want something to really encapsulate it, it's poor old Ronald McDonald, who hasn't opened up in a new country for 4 years now. Who's actually seen the last golden arches close in 2 countries, Iceland, and I forget what the other one is. So globalisation is still definitely important, but it's a much less potent driver of the spread of non-communicable diseases than it was a decade ago. Okay, pause for thought. What's happening with NCD deaths? And as always, I like to start with the donut of death here. So if we take all deaths in the world, I told you we divide them into 3 groups. We've got injuries here, 10%. Group 1, imaginatively called, which is deaths around childhood, malnutrition and infections. And then what's currently 72% of all deaths, non-communicable diseases. But if you think about how you would like to die, it's probably not in childbirth or from pneumonia or being hit by a bus. It's probably from a heart attack when you're asleep, when you're 102, after having lived a rich and fulfilling life. So what are we trying to get at with NCD deaths? We're not trying to stop them all. In fact, we want all deaths to be NCDs, really. What we're trying to stop is young deaths from NCDs. And the WHO defines these as premature deaths, which it's arbitrarily said are any deaths occurring in people aged under 70, which lots of civil society groups have said is ageist, but they had to pick a number, I guess. Sorry to all the over 70-year-olds out there. So of this wedge, about a third of all NCD deaths, which is where we want to focus action, where do they occur? Are they mainly in rich countries or mainly in poor countries? And again, decades ago, the image of an NCD was a stressed, overweight, smoking banker in the city of London having a heart attack and collapsing on the pavement. But that's just not the case these days. In fact, 82% of all NCD deaths occur in low and middle income countries, LMICs, leaving 18% of deaths occurring in high income countries, HICs. This factoid, the 82%, has been used for a long time by advocacy groups to say that NCDs are unjust. They disproportionately strike the world's poorest people. I led a piece of research which looked into it, and we found that actually 82% of the world's population exactly live in low and middle income countries. So this probably isn't the best statistic to be using when trying to defend the injustice of NCDs. A better way of coming at the question is to think about what's the probability that you'll die young from an NCD, which adjusts for population size. So I've got a nice 100-year-old here lighting up on her birthday cake. But again, looking at the risk of dying before you're 70 in high-income countries versus low-income countries, where do you think your risk is higher? So yeah, it is actually low and middle-income countries for a range of reasons that we can delve into. What's happening around the world then in terms of these deaths is that in high-income countries over the past 20 years, NCDs have been causing around 90% of all deaths. But in poorer countries, as they've got better at managing infections and maternal deaths and just generally getting richer, that share has been increasing over time. But what about the absolute number? The total number of people dying from NCDs this year, is it higher or lower than last year, than the year 2000, than the year 1990? Well, the answer is that the absolute number is also rising over time. But you've got to be careful here because the world population is rising over time. So we'd expect that there are more absolute deaths. What we're really interested in is the rate of death increasing or decreasing over time. So for 100,000 people, how many deaths are there due to NCDs? And is that going up or is that going down? And how's that changing by income group? Is it going up in low-income countries or? Anyway, cut to the chase. It's been pretty static in high-income countries. The share of people dying has been pretty static. It's going up in middle-income countries. But the rate is actually decreasing in lower-income countries, which is slightly counterintuitive. And again, it's something that we can get to in the discussion if you'd like to. But for now, let's just tuck that slide over to the edge and just summarize, because that was a lot of data. The proportion of deaths attributable to NCDs are rising over time. That's commonly touted in the press, on front pages, and in the introductions to studies on NCDs. But really, it's a bit misleading because lots of that's been driven by the fact that other causes of death are falling. The absolute numbers of NCDs of NCD deaths are also rising. But again, that's misleading because of population growth. Once we adjust for all of that and just look at rates, NCD deaths are actually pretty static. In fact, they're very static in high-income countries. They're going up in upper middle-income countries, and they're falling in low-income countries. Okay, I hope that's all clear. What's happening with NCD risk factors, with tobacco, with diet, and with alcohol? And again, I hope you're enjoying these as much as I am. We've got another bar chart here. This time it's going from left to right. I've got the three main ones: tobacco, dietary risks, and alcohol. I've thrown in physical activity because that's a common NCD risk factor as well. And then this is from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. They've given me some other slightly random ones: malnutrition, unsafe sex, drug use, and violence and child sexual abuse. So let's hope that's not too high. Which is the leading cause of death? 3, 2, 1. Well, okay, this time they're in ranked order, and tobacco and dietary risks are by far and away the leading risk factors around the world. They're more than double the risk from alcohol use, and they absolutely dwarf physical inactivity, which is interesting when you think that the weighting is almost equally accorded to them. Government advice is often around all 4 things: don't smoke, don't drink, get exercise, and eat healthily. Really, you want to be focusing on tobacco and diet, wouldn't you? So let's just take each of the 3 risk factors in turn. And the reason we're focusing on these 3 is these are the commercial ones. These are risk factors where there's a profit to be made for the companies. So first off, smoking. Be glad to hear that smoking rates are falling around the world. So although it's the leading risk factor, hopefully that will not be the case in the future. This chart plots the number of adults who smoked in 2016 against the number who smoked in the year 2000. And we've got this line running through the middle here. And all countries above the line have seen smoking rates drop. So let's just pull out European countries. Started at around 40% in 2000 and have fallen down to about 30% in 2016. And we've got some African countries down here. They started at a lower base and they also dropped as well, by not quite as much. Few outliers. I don't know what's happening in Congo, but everyone started smoking there since the year 2000. Alcohol next. Have we reached peak booze? Yes, we have. More good news. I think this is probably being driven by hipsters. But despite the fact that the number of people on Earth has grown a lot since 1994, the amount of alcohol drunk by each person has been falling. It's stalled since about 2015. Whereas alcohol drunk most, well, Russia are really going at it. So are Mongolia. In fact, everyone else kind of pales into insignificance. As you can see, North Africa and the Middle East, where obviously for religious reasons, lots of people don't drink as much there. And then Europe and Australia normally don't come off too well either. And then the third risk factor is diet. There isn't a neat way of talking about poor diet because it encompasses eating meat, eating processed food, eating salt, eating trans fats, eating other bad fats, not eating enough fruits, not eating enough vegetables, not eating enough legumes, not eating enough nuts. But this study, which comes from the Global Burden of Disease collaborators and was published in The Lancet, tries to lump together all of those things and looks at where is diet worst. And again, I was surprised because I thought it would be the USA, but again, we see the former Soviet countries and some of the stans doing really badly here. And again, the islands aren't picked out, but small island states traditionally do bad with this as well. And the Mediterranean companies, we all know, are very good and have a very healthy diet there. Okay, so that's a brief overview of those 3 risk factors. The next question I want to ask is, what's driving consumption of these vectors of disease? Where do we see smoking and alcohol and unhealthy foods purchased, and what drives it? This comes from the book chapter I wrote on this recently on the commercial determinants of global health in the Springer textbook on global health. And I've tried to divide them into 3 main areas. So I think consumption happens where these goods are available, where they're affordable, and where they're acceptable. So they're economic, logistical, and cultural factors at play there. So let's pick Coca-Cola. Let's pick something a bit more. Another can. Let's have a can of Heineken. If I was an executive at Heineken and I'm trying to get more people to drink it, and if I'm a public health person tasked with the brief of reducing harm from alcohol, I want to be thinking about these factors. So let's start with available. Do you have to be over 18 to drink, or 21 in the States? Can you only buy alcohol from places that have a license? Can you only buy alcohol at certain times? So are there pub curfews, for instance? And obviously right now with coronavirus, the curfews have been massively tightened. How easy is it to get my product on a truck to the endpoint, to the shop? What's the kind of regulatory burden and environment and ease of doing business in this country? And then lots of bits around the culture and acceptability. Is this an Islamic state? What are the traditions in the country? For instance, drinking champagne on New Year's Eve, or dry January. How's it fit in with the national identity if you're Irish, or blah, blah, blah. You can read it off there. But these are the kind of things that drive and shape consumption, situated in the broader macro factors for each country. So, how Venezuela has very different macroeconomic conditions to the UK at the moment. What's the climate and geography? It's much more challenging, although not impossible, to get your Coke up the Pingu River in Brazil than it is to Brussels. Social and political volatility. Yet Sudan and Syria aren't great places for trying to sell things at the moment. The government competency in taxing and regulating things, and thinking about corruption as well. And then just your national history. That's one set of things that drive consumption or prevent it. There's another major thing that drives consumption of unhealthy commodities, and that is the profit motive. And I wanted to share a piece of research that I led last year with some colleagues, where we looked at the top 10 publicly listed companies in tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthy food and drinks. And for this small clutch of companies, I got their financial records, and we asked the question, how profitable are they? And then as a sector, and how much money are they making? And you can see that profitability, which are these dots, ranges from 7% for processed foods up to 30% for tobacco. So huge margins there. But also the profits they're making are ginormous. A piece of work from some colleagues at Harvard suggests that it would cost around $11 billion to introduce measures to prevent non-communicable diseases in every single low and middle income country. $11 billion. The combined sales from this small clutch of companies was $829 billion just in 2017, with collective profits of $99 billion. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should take all of those profits away and spend them on preventing NCDs. And also, it's not quite a fair comparison, because preventing NCDs isn't actually that expensive, and things like taxing tobacco raises money. But when you think about the amount of money there is to be made in pushing these products, you begin to realize why it's so difficult to prevent them, and why the spread has been so hard to tackle. Coca-Cola spends $4 billion on advertising every year, which is more than the public health budget for most small countries. And just in the USA, tobacco firms spend $1 million every hour on advertising cigarettes. So they're truly astounding numbers. Okay, take a breath. Next bits. How can we stop overconsumption? I've previously alluded to the fact that the World Health Organization has got a set of cost-effective interventions. And it's a menu that they call the best buys. Best buys because they are highly cost-effective, so really, really good bang for buck. They're cheap, they're affordable in every country in the world, and they have a proven track record of working. There are 18 or 19 of them, depending on the year. I've just pulled out the ones relating to tobacco, alcohol, and diet here. And you can see that there are things like taxing things, banning things, warning people, and educating people across the board. And I've been involved in two large bits of research, large in terms of how much time they've taken up, but they've been fascinating in terms of looking at how well different governments are doing around the world in implementing these policies. As I've said before, they don't cost very much. Some of them actually make money. They work, and everyone knows that these are big problems. So the first paper was published in the Lancet Global Health last November. And I can see, or I saw earlier, that Simon Wigley, who is a collaborator, and Hampus Holmer are my co-collaborators for the update that we've just submitted, again, to the Lancet Global Health. And I just wanted to share a few of the preliminary results there. These aren't peer-reviewed, so please don't share them. Here we go. So This is a list of all 19 of the best buys that address NCDs. And this is looking at the change in how many countries had implemented them in 2015 versus 2020. And all the ones in green, more countries were implementing them in 2020 than were in 2015. But these ones in reds have gone into reverse. The ones at the top are things which are quite easy to do. They're kind of like having the paperwork in place. So having guidelines, setting some targets, having an action plan are the top three. They don't really require that much effort, do they? The things at the bottom are taking firm action against alcohol, constraining the sale of breast milk alternatives, and salt and physical activity policies. So it's awful to see these things going into reverse. Overall, just under half of the policies are being implemented around the world. And if you look by where they're being implemented, we've got a heat map here. So let me just walk you through this. Again, this is all 19 of the policies, and then what percentage of former Soviet states have implemented them. So here we've got some different geopolitical blocs: former Soviet states, OECD members, the EU 27, G20 countries, Gulf states, and small island developing states, so very small countries in the sea. Here we've broken up all countries by income group: high, middle, low, middle income and low. And here geographically, so the African region, Western Pacific, Americas, the Eastern Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, and European region. And you can see that the reds tend to cluster around low income and African countries, and the greens are in the richer countries. So former Soviet states actually perform the best of any of the groupings that we have here. And the greens are around physical activity campaigns, clinical guidelines, and graphic warnings on tobacco, and having mortality data systems. Interesting. We went from this to try and think about, okay, can we develop a model to predict which countries will implement NCD policies and which ones won't? And this is the conceptual model that we developed. So we reasoned that implementing these policies is predicated on having the means and the motivation to act, which are embedded in your national context. So your geography, culture and society, and your politics and institutions. Means to act was around, do you have the money, do you have the resources, and do you have the previous track record? We reasoned that two factors would influence the motivation of policymakers. The first is corporate influence. So if corporations have access to policymakers, we thought that they might convince them not to whack great big taxes on unhealthy products. The other form of motivation we thought were health outcomes. So if lots of people are dying from NCDs, and if lots of people are smoking or have high blood pressure or drinking or are overweight, then that might add kind of impetus to take action. So jargon alert, we put this all into a regression model. And in the bivariate unadjusted model, almost all of these factors were significantly associated with implementation. However, when you put them all in at the same time and fully adjusted the model, only two of the factors remain significant in dark blue. The first one down here is the number of people, the percentage of people in your country dying from NCDs. In countries where there's a high proportion, which, as we've seen before, is mainly high-income countries, these countries are more likely to implement NCD policies. That's why they're on the right of the line. The other thing was corporate permeation. And in countries with high levels of corporate permeation, these countries were less likely to implement policy. What is corporate permeation? Well, we used a definition from Lima and Galea, and they define corporate permeation as the extent to which corporations are embedded in the political, legal, social, economic, and cultural fabric of a country. And you might think, okay, USA, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Ireland, maybe Japan, UK, kind of free market countries, but that wasn't the case at all. And then this graph I've just plotted on the up-down axis here, corporate permeation, and countries at the top have high levels, countries at the bottom have low levels. And you can see that, fine, yeah, there's Luxembourg, there's Ireland, but really most of the countries up here are either poor or Eastern European. And the countries at the bottom are kind of Western-style democratic companies. And I was amazed to see Japan at the country with the lowest level of CPI, given the amazing dominance they've had of their keiretsu companies, you know, like Sanwa, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo. But there you go. And I just encourage you to go back to the original source if you'd like to unpack a little bit more the different indicators that go into building this index. But along the bottom axis here, the x-axis, you can see that the countries with the highest level, implementing all 18 policies, well, no one quite got there. Countries with the highest scores at around 16, Brazil and Costa Rica, tended to have lower levels of corporate permeation than the countries with the lowest scores like Haiti, Malawi, Mozambique, and Angola. So there's a pretty messy, but it's a linear negative association. The other thing that was interesting about corporate permeation is the interaction with democracy. Now, we looked at democracies and autocracies defined by the VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Project. We found that democracies had a higher average score when it came to implementing policies of 8.5 out of 18 versus autocracies, which had a score of 7. And the p-value, if you're interested, was less than 0.0001. We also found that corporate permeation was lower in democracies than it was in autocracies. But there was a funny relationship between the two, whereby democracies becoming more democratic increased your policy implementation score. So this is democracy on the up-down, but only for countries that had the lowest levels of corporate permeation, which is along this axis here. So democratic countries here, if you become more democratic, but you've got moderate levels, average levels of corporate permeation, the association becomes disannulled. And actually, in countries that have the highest levels of corporate permeation, although there aren't many, so we've got to be cautious here, democracy looked like it might actually be a negative thing, although the 95% confidence intervals overlap with 0, so really we can't say for sure. What we can say is that democracy, we only found democracy to be a positive thing when it comes to implementing NCD policies in countries with low levels of corporate permeation. I just wanted to share one other quick graph that I've put together, which plots the actual countries so you can see where they sit in those quadrants. And so we're saying, sorry, I keep losing my mouse. We can see that democracy going along here, these are highly democratic countries with low levels of corporate permeation. These are autocratic countries. What I'm saying is that as they become more democratic, ones with lower levels of corporate permeation, below this average line here, we'd expect to see benefits. But for these autocracies that have high levels of corporate permeation, even if they become more democratic, we might not necessarily expect them to implement more NCD policies. And the massive caveat here is that this is association. We're looking at associations here with observational research rather than causation, so we can't say for sure. The last very nerdy thing I wanted to share was a Bland-Altman chart that we've put together, which just says if we take any country and look at their given level of wealth and female education and which neighborhood they're in, all the factors that we know about, what would we expect their implementation score to be for tobacco, alcohol, and diet? And then we can plot that against what it actually was. And it helps us find the outliers. We found no overperformers, but we found a cluster of underperformers. And in here, we've got, well, Japan's on the borderline, China, the USA, Barbados, Algeria, and Haiti. It's just had a rough deal, hasn't it? In every single chart, it's doing terribly. But the USA and China are massive countries with huge combined populations, which really should be doing better compared with their peers when it comes to constraining these bad vectors of disease. Okay, so we're moving into the final third here. We can stop overconsumption. We've got effective tools. They're being underused. Only half of countries are using them. But should we be stopping overconsumption? I think the starting place here is who is responsible for health. And I wanted to share a piece of research from the Health Foundation and Ipsos Mori, the polling firm. They performed a survey in the UK population in 2018, repeated it recently this year. They were asking who has responsibility for health. The actual wording was, how much responsibility do each of these have for ensuring that people generally stay healthy? So we've got the NHS, we've got the national government, local government, which controls the local environment, individuals, and the food and drink industry. And again, I think this might be the last one. I'd like you to think about which one's going to be the highest, and the other interesting things change over time. So I think unsurprisingly, individuals come away as everyone thinks that we are ultimately responsible for our own health. What's been interesting in the data is that the NHS has hit a huge jump, and so has the government. And this is really around coronavirus and a heightened public awareness of the role of state intervention in affecting health outcomes. Interesting that the food and drinks industry has gone down despite the fact that there's been a massive push by both industries to try and undermine public health legislation during the pandemic, and sales have really increased. So has the food density of the average Britain's food basket. It's gone up the highest for the poorest people in the population. So that's who people think are responsible for health. What is actually responsible for health? So I've got a pie chart here, which presents...
just one, sorry to interrupt you. We have some questions. Would you prefer to pick them all at the end, or you would like to answer them as we go?
I think I'd like to collect them and answer them at the end, if that's okay. And if you could group them into themes, then we could tackle them like that. Is that okay?
That's all right. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks. So I've got some potential causes here. DNA, the choices you make, the kind of health infrastructure, and the environment in which you're born and grow up in. And this is all health outcomes. And it's a pie chart I've squidged together based on 3 different studies presented on this King's Fund page, which summarizes the wider determinants of health. So where do they go? Where do you think? What do you think is the most important determinant in shaping health outcomes in Western Europe and the world? Really, there's no reason to suspect that this doesn't apply globally. Well, the smallest part of the pie comes down to medical services like the NHS. Maybe remarkably, if we got rid of the NHS, that wouldn't make a big difference to health outcomes, the diseases people get and how often they die. The next biggest chunk is your DNA. It's pretty immutable, but there you go. Followed by individual choices and behavior at around 1/4 to 1/3. And then the environment, which isn't just like leaves and grass, but looking around you and the availability of unhealthy products and the regulatory environment and the tax infrastructure and schooling opportunities and job opportunities. That really is the lion's share of what dictates how long you'll live, what you'll die of, and how healthy you will be as you go. I wonder if that's surprising. I think for anyone who comes at this from a public health angle, this is beaten into us from a young age, so no. But maybe from the health policy angle, that is surprising. Who's got responsibility for it? Well, no one has for DNA. That's us, and the rest is possibly the state. Again, yeah, sorry, is it surprising? Well, seriously, no. Think about where you're born and compare that to someone born in a slum, or someone who's gone to Eton, or someone who's grown up in the outskirts of Wolverhampton, or is, in Lewisham on the, let's think of Lewisham High Street for a second, versus where I am now in Goring and Streatley in Berkshire. I have got no betting shops where we live. I've got no traffic, so the air quality is fantastic. I've got 2 very good primary schools here. We do have a chippy, but compared to those streets in Lewisham where it's just chicken shop after chicken shop after chicken shop, there's no advertising here, so I'm not seeing billboards for Cadbury's or anything else. And well, the job opportunities aren't great because we're in a village, but it's a commuter town with a train line to London, so everyone here is a hedge fund manager. Where you live, where you're born, where you grow up, where you work, massively constrains and shapes the choices available to you. The cultural norm here is that you just don't smoke, and it's quite hard to actually get hold of cigarettes, which is completely different to if I've grown up on an estate somewhere. And a piece of work I led in 2017 was a global systematic review that looked at these risk factors in relationship to your socioeconomic class. We found that while in some countries richer people have worse diet than other people, and it's mixed, for tobacco and alcohol, really it's poorer people tend to drink more and smoke more wherever you are on earth. In terms of whose responsibility that is again, in 2005, the Chief Medical Officer in the UK produced these top 10 tips in January, trying to capitalise on the upcoming New Year's resolutions. And their advice was, number 1, don't smoke, don't drink, keep active, manage stress. And it's all about us making good choices. And my alma mater, University of Bristol, they've got this Townsend poverty group, and they produce their alternative top tips, which really get to the heart of what you can do to live healthy. Don't be poor. If you are poor, try not to be poor for too long. Don't live in a deprived area. If you do, move. Don't live in damp, low quality housing or be homeless. Often these are things that you can't really affect if you're poor. Is this real? Am I just making it up? Well, if we look at obesity rates by neighbourhoods, if you live in the most deprived neighbourhoods in the UK, your kid is much more likely to be overweight than if you live in the least deprived areas. And if we look at an even more macro statistic, life expectancy in the UK, we've plotted, well, the ONS, Office for National Statistics, has plotted every single neighbourhood here for their upper tier local authorities, from most deprived to least deprived. And we can see that life expectancy is lower in poorer areas and higher in richer areas, and the same for healthy life expectancy. How long can you expect to live in good health? And if we plot on the current state retirement age, it's appalling, isn't it? Because only the people living in the richest third of neighbourhoods can expect to spend any time in healthy retirement. Now, I know if you work hard and get rich, you move to a nicer neighbourhood. But even after you strip out these people, the effect is still there. So the point is that many of the factors that shape our behaviour aren't actually under our control. Not all of them, but a large chunk. With that in mind, what should government do? What should they do with alcohol, junk food and cigarettes? I love this thing. It's called the Ladder of Public Health Interventions. It comes from the Nuffield Council of Bioethics. It's old but gold. And there's a spectrum, isn't there, from doing nothing through to nudging people. I mean, everyone's answer is always just tell people what to do, which is kind of this knowledge deficit model. People make bad choices because they don't know any different. Tell them that smoking's bad and then they'll just stop. Through to nudging to make people make better decisions, to taxing things, to regulating, to banning things like driving without a seatbelt or leaded petrol. And again, there's a spectrum of political and philosophical views here. So one extreme would be Thomas Hobbes. Rulers should basically the government should stop people doing anything that harms them. So we should ban chocolate, although you can eat it in moderation. So we should ban alcohol because, the research is really firm on the fact that there's no safe level of drinking. At the other end would be someone like John Locke. The sole purpose of government is to protect and enlarge freedoms. I think most Western democracies try to interfere in people's lives as little as possible, following John Stuart Mill's maxim, which is that the only reason that we should meddle in people's choices is to prevent them from harming other people. I think that's really quite innate in our culture, and most people inherently agree with that reasoning. However, there's been an increasing recognition that tobacco, alcohol, and junk food cause societal harm, as well as negative externalities. That is to say that your own actions, drinking alcohol, doesn't seem to affect anyone else on the face of it, but actually you end up using NHS resources, and it's associated with massive amounts of crime and family breakdown. And if we eat or something even more innocuous like eating chocolate, if you become overweight, again, the obesity problem is crippling our country. It costs us more than smoking and physical inactivity and alcohol use combined for the NHS. It's billions of pounds a year. And if we look to what happened with Boris Johnson and contracting coronavirus, it puts additional strain on the health system. So I think increasingly, particularly now, and with what we've seen with climate change already laying the groundwork in terms of governments being more willing to interfere with things like carbon pricing and constraining those wider externalities, there's more of an appetite to interfere and meddle with personal decisions. I mean, I couldn't say that stuff without putting in Milton Friedman, who just had some absolutely wonderful quotes from his time, mainly around business, and is known for his kind of the primacy of shareholders. But here are these two. The government solution to a problem is usually as bad as the problem. And I love this one. If you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years, there'd be a shortage of sand. So just to really come in and close on this bit then, yeah, there's a spectrum of positions here, and in the chat, it would be great to hear your position, where you think government should intervene, and it's got to be nuanced, hasn't it? The response to tobacco is going to be different to the response to dyeing bars. Just wanted to end with my view around tobacco, which is probably the one where it's most straightforward. It's on the line from respecting civil liberties, and as a doctor, I've got a role to respect unwise decisions. to completely constraining it. I think cigarettes should be treated like guns are in Japan. So the death rate from guns in Japan is absolutely tiny if you compare it to somewhere like the USA or even Canada. But they are perfectly legal. Any adult can own and fire a gun. However, the process is long and ensures that only people who really, really, really want to own a gun and fire a gun end up owning and firing guns. And I think tobacco should be the same way. If you want to smoke, fine, you can smoke. I don't think tobacco should be outlawed, but only people who have really done their research and are committed to it end up smoking. Because at the moment, it is very easy to have your first take on what is an addictive product. And lots of kids, most smokers start smoking in childhood. So there we go. Let's just end where we started. I asked the question, what's killing us? Spoiler alert, it was non-communicable diseases. They are increasingly killing us, despite the fact that rates are going down. NCDs are mainly killing us because we're getting better at treating other things. Yeah, what's happening with deaths? Well, fine, the rates aren't going down. They're pretty static, though, and actually decreasing in low-income countries. It's the middle-income countries that we want to be watching out for. What's happening with the risk factors? Well, actually, it looks like the tide is turning on tobacco and alcohol, but they still cause massive amounts of harm today. And the fact that consumption rates are going down does not excuse government inaction for now. Diet is a very thorny, difficult issue because there's no such thing as unhealthy food. There's just unhealthy diet. So it's unfair to penalise one particular product, maybe with the exception of trans fats. And how and should we stop overconsumption? Well, we've got this toolkit of really effective policies, but they're by no means the totality of what could and should be done, but we've got a good starting place. Fewer than half of those policies are being implemented, should they be? And I think that's a good place to close. I just wanted to finish by saying all of my research has been with some fantastic colleagues, and I can't claim the credit for any of it. The sources are all there. I think this is going up on YouTube, so you'll be able to get to the original ones. I've got my full publication list through this link here where you can get to those papers. And I just wanted to leave as well this is in 2 minutes, so apologies for the glaring omissions. Some fantastic people working in this space to follow, but I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation. We have, as I mentioned before, a number of questions. I'll just try to organize them in groups for you, but I'll start with a question that was posted a few minutes ago by Sharif Ismail.
Yeah.
Basically, the idea that the reversal in breast milk code adherence he finds it striking and alarming, given the long history of work at place. Any idea why that's the case? And then he wants a clarification around the term political regimes, which you use. And then he made a third point as well on the best buys, the WHO best buys for low resource settings.
Yeah.
He wants you to basically expand on this, particularly in low and middle income countries.
Okay.
And then I guess we can stop there, and then we have a bunch of other questions too. So
of the three, I know the least about the breast milk code, if I'm honest. So I'm going to skip that one. It is very complicated what's going on there, and there are two very good breast milk code activist groups, the names of which I don't know. I think one is babycode.org or something. A quick Google will get you to some fantastic advocacy materials there. Google it, I'm sorry, that will be better than me. In terms of regimes, we've used the varieties of democracy, which is, again, a Googleable group that produces it scores every country, not every country, a large number of countries, and sorts their regime types and gives them a democracy score based on a wide number of indicators. I would go and check that out there, but broadly you can split them into autocracies and democracies, and it's just there's a cutoff between how democratic a country is. In the first piece of research that was published in The Lancet, my group actually used the Economist Intelligence Unit that has different political regime types. There are a few other classifications that can be used, and again, Simon Wigley and colleagues posted a letter replying in the Lancet, which gives a bit more detail. So I'd look at that there. And again, that's in that publication list to look more about. The bit about best buys, yeah. So NCDs, they cause 70% of all deaths, but they weren't in the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000. And it was a bit of an afterthought. And around the year 2011, the UN, the WHO and governments were thinking, oh my gosh, what have we done? We should probably start taking some action here. And the unlikely hero of the dyad of Margaret Chen and Vladimir Putin put together a meeting to get together some academics and some country leaders to say, okay, which interventions could we be implementing around the world that are cheap and effective, that could be used in low and middle income countries? They produced a long list basically, and then they went through with actually fairly opaque methods and divided them into groups and said, okay, these are like the pretty good buys, and these are the absolute best buys, which give you fantastic bang for buck. Now, this is a political process, and there's interference from countries like the USA that don't want to see measures constraining tax. And it's been very well documented that the WHO has had difficulty when it comes to trying to recommend policies that constrain the sale of export commodities from rich countries. That's just been a whole world of pain. But we've got to a place now where the WHO is saying, yeah, you should be really taking firm action to try and stop companies selling stuff that kills people. You'd think that wouldn't be too difficult, would you? It's quite a short list. It doesn't cover lots of the risk factors that affect the people living in poverty. So Jean Berkman's just recently led the Lancet Commission on NCDs and injuries for people living in poverty, looking at the unique set of risk factors facing the bottom billion around the world. The current list of best buys really focuses just on the four main risk factors, which are diet, tobacco, alcohol, and physical inactivity. So it's been a painful process getting there. They probably do work. That isn't the sum of what we should be doing, and progress hasn't been fast enough. There's definitely more we should be doing. The final thought is I've done some research which looks at where the evidence comes from. Overwhelmingly, the evidence for these interventions comes from rich countries, because that's where the research is done. And we also need more evidence to just double check that they actually do work in the countries where 80% of the world's population lives. Okay, next step. Thank you.
So a bunch of other questions now. There is one by Marian Fletcher about the environment, and I would add to it as well. I mean, you seem to suggest that the environment plays a very important role here, but there might be indirect ways through which it plays a role, for instance, through corporations. So it could well be that corporations play a role in shaping the environment and influencing behavior. We know that could be marketing strategies. And I would even argue there is a role here for epigenetics. So, which, I mean, you seem to portray a view of genetics as deterministic, and we know that the environment and the genes are constantly interacting. So it could well be that genetics plays a much heavier role, and that the environment is actually indirectly influencing genes. Yeah. Another point, more methodological, which I know that might, I mean, I'm an economist myself, so it could well be that it's more the result of my upbringing. But the idea here is that I know that the social determinants of health literature plays a huge weight on constraints to behavior, as if constraints were kind of deterministic in producing a behavioral change or an outcome. And I guess one of the potential influences on behavior and non-communicable diseases is the role of the choice architecture. So you could potentially get the government to intervene, change incentives, but not just the traditional incentives like prices, just the choice architecture, which affects how people think, which is the standard sort of claim of behavioral economics, which might not just, as I said, change prices, but change values as well, and indirectly then change culture, which will inevitably then change the environment. So, you know, in a way, there is a middle ground between individualism, which was I think it was Locke's idea, and then or Stuart Mill's idea, and the view of the Hobbesian idea that the government should change behavior. So there must be like a middle ground there, and perhaps behavioral economics has something to add there.
Can I take those? And I'm going to start from the bottom and work up. So I think behavioral economics has been a boon. It's fantastic. but I think it's been oversold in public health. It's the first thing. The second is it's courses for horses. And for tobacco, I'm not going to wait around and nudge people. It kills people. Half of its users die. You need firm interventions. For things like getting outdoors more, yes, there's a role for softer interventions. We don't need a blanket approach for everything. And it's going to take, I think, lots of public health interventions, for instance, taxing sugary drinks, get slammed because it only makes a small impact. You know, it reduces obesity by 1 to 2%. But when obesity is crippling your economy and leads to misery and death, we need to be using every single possible available thing that's been shown to be effective. So we're going to end up with a panoply of approaches. I think behavioral economics is important, and it's great because, I mean, governments love it, don't they? Think of the number 10 nudge unit, particularly conservative leaning governments, because you're not constraining choice. You're just pushing people towards looking left at the stop sign in London or wherever it is. But we can't do that at the expense of taking effective evidence-based action when we're in the middle of an emergency. And if you think of coronavirus, you've just got to take fast action now. NCDs are a bit more of a slow motion train wreck, but NCDs kill a lot more people and will be killing a lot more people this year than even a world pandemic. So yeah, there's definitely a place for it. A similar kind of philosophy to epigenetics. You might have seen my disclaimer to say it's kind of immutable. Yeah, you're right, they're not. What Zhao means there is you do have your DNA, but you've got different bits of your DNA that could be turned on and off depending on what you're exposed to. And in the womb, if your mum smokes or drinks, it can make you turn out a little bit different than if you hadn't been exposed to that in the womb. And as you grow up, especially, I mean, the impact's largest when you're youngest, as you're growing up, the world in which you live, particularly toxins that get into your bloodstream and stress, manifest in your body and how you regulate things and your risk of having heart attacks and strokes later on. So yeah, there definitely is a role there. What I would say is that that pie chart, I was trying to illustrate that we often focus on the role of the individual and choices, and actually lots of those determinants are outside of our control. Actually, with epigenetics, whatever share you take out of DNA is going to be added to the environment side of the equation. So I don't think we should be saying, yeah, there's more of a role for individuals. I think we've got that covered. People understand that they've got a role to play, which leads us up to the first question, which was around the interaction between corporations and the environment. Absolutely, yes, corporations do have a huge role on the environment. Some of the factors I listed are massive. So schooling, maybe not so much job opportunities. Well, yeah, corporations have a very positive impact there. The availability of unhealthy food and cigarettes, yeah, they have a very negative effect there. It's pervasive. And what's interesting is that our current piece of research that we hope is out with you in the new year, we've tried to pick that up with this corporate permeation index, which looks at exactly that, the extent to which corporations are embedded in the fabric of society. And yeah, what was interesting is that corporations seem to have much greater sway in poorer societies. I think the other thing to bring in here is a great piece by Martin McKee and David Stuckler that was in the American Journal of Public Health around the commercial determinants of health, which was just talking about power and what kind of power do corporations have. And the old school version of power is, you know, strong arming people into doing what you want them to. But increasingly, there's this nascent, unused, kind of latent capacity to influence. Corporations don't necessarily have to be exercising their power, but can be in powerful positions with access to policymakers and lobbyists in Parliament, etc., etc. And I'm really not trying to promote my book chapter, but it lists lots of other people's research, which it's a very well documented area how corporations have perniciously influenced health behavior to boost profits and cause harm. Although my other caveat is that corporations are also part of the answer, and we're employed by companies and they can be a force for good. They're not all bad, and making money isn't necessarily bad. It's how you go about doing it.
And then, Pepita, do you want to formulate your questions? You have two questions from Pepita.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Joanne. Yeah, and thank you, Luke, for a great presentation. So I had two questions. The first is about the quote from J.S. Mill that you provided, which, if one takes the focus away from individuals to businesses, could be used to justify measures that curb the actions of corporations that cause harms on others. But we have seen that we have failed to flip the narrative in this way. We talk about personal responsibility and less about corporate responsibility. So I just wonder if you could offer some speculation about why it is that we've failed to ask those questions about the responsibilities of corporations in our society and what we can do to ensure that they sustain health. Sort of why aren't we asking that question? And then second of all, I have to bang my trade matters drum. So I was wondering if you could just talk us through whether you think the global trade regime comes into your conceptual framework of motivations for introducing NCD policies, and if so, how?
Great, thanks, Professor. I'm going to, again, flip it and start with the trade regime first. And yeah, there's a massive body of literature around international trade flows. And of course, we've got a very established author here as well, who writes on this topic. When countries are deciding at the moment whether or not they're going to introduce those set of best buys, am I going to introduce a tax on tobacco? Am I going to start constraining the sale of alcohol? Something that weighs very heavily in their minds is, what's this going to do to overall GDP? And am I going to get taken to court by Philip Morris? There have been a number of cases where corporations that sell these commodities have actually taken countries to the World Trade Organization or other bodies and tried to sue them on kind of anti-competition grounds. And increasingly trade agreements, which used to just be about tariffs, will, you know, the import tariff on cars will drop it from 20% to 10% each way to increase trade. They're getting more and more detailed, which isn't necessarily bad, but increasingly they include these things called behind the border agreements. So before it was just about what happens when a good crosses the border, but increasingly it's also what happens inside the country with my cigarettes that I'm selling to you, which allows countries and governments to be taken to court for actions to try and constrain the sale of alcohol and tobacco and other goods. So for the UK, that's really, really important. And I think probably comes to mind with chlorinated chicken in talking about a potential US agreement. But again, there's lots of examples. Probably the most famous one is Samoa, a little island that wanted to join the World Trade Organization and was basically told off because the US was exporting really fatty turkey tails. So you can eat the tails of turkeys, which were basically an industrial waste product, but they found a market in Samoa. They are incredibly bad for your health. And the Samoan government introduced some kind of tax measures to try and make them more expensive to stop people eating them and dying from consuming them. And the World Trade Organization said, look, you can't join us and because that's an unfair barrier to trade, you're going to have to drop it. So there's a direct tension between public health and international trade. It's a huge area, we could go on, but yes, it's really important. It's particularly important for Britain right now. And yeah, who knows what's going to happen under Biden, what's going to be happening with the US and China with their trade war there. But I mean, I think there has been a lot more insularity recently, and I think that will probably continue. Looking again at Modi and what's happening with India, there's kind of the zeitgeist of self-reliance, but international trade is still a big thing. Okay, it's not the same as it was in 2007, but these agreements are going to be major, major determinants of health. Okay, and then why have we done such a bad job at switching the narrative from it's all about individuals making bad choices? We blame poor people for making poor choices. And I think part of that goes back to that poll. When you ask people who's responsible for health, it's innate. We just think that we are because that's all you see. And that gets to a cognitive bias that we think we're more in control of our destiny than we actually are. And kind of the illusion of free will. We don't like to think that we've been influenced by corporations or advertising or anything else. Maybe other people do, but I'm too smart for that, is kind of the common cognitive bias there. So being told that the environment is a big issue and corporations are a big issue is insulting to our own intelligence. And so due to kind of other assimilation biases, there are many reasons that we wouldn't want to hear it. Also, if we look at the positioning, the kind of political and economic positioning of governments that have been in power in the OECD over the past 20 years, they've been quite kind of Millian about really pushing for personal responsibility. And again, in the UK, the Conservative-led government is definitely of that ilk that, it's about you making the right choice. It's not about us. If we think back to Thatcher, Reagan, there's no such thing as society. It's all down to you to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you're born poor, well, just get on with it. Plenty of people do, so why shouldn't you? So I think you're fighting inertia is the first thing. The second very important thing is that what have we got to gain from changing the narrative? Not a lot. Healthier population, but that's distributed benefit. Who stands to lose? Well, corporations that get to sell lots of money without being taxed very much, who, as I've shown, have lots and lots of money. And every time a new potential restriction comes in, for instance, the sugary drinks tax, Coke takes out full-page adverts in every newspaper saying it's bad and will hurt the poorest and is unfair and will damage business. And as Boris Johnson came out of hospital and was talking more about obesity and public health, people were saying, great, at last we can start trying to change the environment. Companies started putting adverts out and trying to frame themselves as, we are core for the economy and we're the good Samaritans here, and we're giving food to NHS workers. And they've got, we don't have access to advertising agencies, multi-million-pound advertising agencies to spin that story. And they do, so it's a really unfair battle. And again, there's another body of literature out there about it. So it would be fascinating if it wasn't so horrific.
Great, thank you so much. We have a couple more questions, and I have another one myself. One on the role of disruptive technologies, such as e-cigarettes, impacting on ill health and death. So what's your view on that? Second one on whether high-income countries bear any responsibility for the role of corporations in low-income countries. So whether there is a role, perhaps, from governments in higher-income countries, perhaps to intervene there. No? Yeah. And then a final question that is linked to that one on the role of corporations. So from what you are saying, I mean, one translation into sort of an economics language would be that there is some level of capture. So interest groups, corporations as interest groups are capturing the government. So basically one solution that could be provided to that would be that perhaps the health advocate groups should lobby better the governments. Yeah. So, because I mean, if you look at the public choice models, what basically they say is that interest group intervention is not bad so long as there is competition there. So long as some lobbies that advocate for better health or health improvement are able to overcome the pressure of, let's say, commercial lobbies.
Yeah.
So what you're suggesting is that commercial lobbies seem to still do better than other lobbies, basically.
Yeah. Okay, I've established a trend of doing them in reverse order, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I don't mind at all lobbying governments, whoever you are, whatever issue you have. It's what makes democracy vibrant, and I think if we constrain that, we do it at our peril. But what's the Washington Post strapline? Democracy dies in darkness. I think at the moment it is the process is just obfuscated and opaque, and what actually happens is corporations have differential access to policymakers. OpenSecrets.org sounds like a conspiracy, but is a fantastic civil society organization working in America to bring sunlight to the business of corporate lobbying. And they've got some good interactive graphic-y bits to go and play with. Very, very few, I think 3 countries have open public registries of who is lobbying elected representatives. All democracies should have open, they're just like records where you can go in and see who lobbied who about what and if money changed hands. It's frankly ridiculous that we don't have that. That's leaving aside the differences in money. Yeah, I agree, civil society should do a better job. I count myself as a civil society person. I should be doing a better job. We all should be. Again, I think the issue is that we're quite atomized, whereas the tobacco lobby and the food lobby is very concentrated. And if you think about the job that the Scotch Whisky Association did to counter minimum unit pricing in Scotland, it's hard to rival that with a coalition of the willing. And even if you did, our budget comes from voluntary donations, which is often, minuscule. So we just don't have, we can't attract the brightest and the best lobbyists and pay for as much of their time. So more sunlight required would be a very good first step there. Do high-income countries bear responsibility for their role in low-income countries? I mean, the subtext here is kind of repatriations and colonialism. I think I do, again, let's start with the basics of doing things well. At the moment, the USA stops things from going on in international law and in WHO agreements that would constrain its business interests abroad, and isn't taking measures to slow down or stop the sale of unhealthy goods in places. It's putting profit above people, and that is abhorrent and I think needs to stop. And again, as health people, we can get a bit transfixed on health above everything else, and wealth is definitely important, and having jobs is important, and widening the tax base is important, and international collaboration is all important. But yes, there is responsibility to make sure that the trade agreements you're signing and the things you're exporting are not kicking the world's poorest people in the head when they've got enough going on already. So absolutely, I agree, they do have responsibility there. In terms of repatriation or making amends for it, I'd probably go about that in terms of overseas development assistance, and maybe tying the money that you give to countries to the harm that you've done in the past. But again, I wouldn't want to get into hypothecating too tightly, because it can end up being unhelpful in the long run. And then disruptive technology. I think by and large, I hate technology. I think a bit like the behavioural interventions, they're just promulgated as being the answer to everything. And I know that's not at all what you were saying, but we know what works. Let's just get on and do basic public health like sanitation and taxing cigarettes. Yeah, e-cigarettes are, I was going to say they're good. I'm pretty neutral on them. If I think about my patients, I've got smokers who use them. They tend to use them alongside traditional cigarettes as opposed to instead of. And we're definitely seeing young people using e-cigarettes. And obviously, the tension here is, are they just a gateway to reverse the decline in smoking? And again, there's a spectrum. So some companies and some people within those companies are genuinely trying to market and position e-cigarettes as a way of kicking the world's habit to tobacco. Other companies and people within companies are very deliberately trying to use e-cigarettes to try and get people back in love with tobacco as a gateway drug. So you've just got to exercise caution. And I think with disruptive tech, you don't really know how it's going to go. So it's always a bit of a gamble. And maybe this is philosophically conservative of me, but I think until we're doing the basics well, I wouldn't want to put my eggs in the basket of, or place too much emphasis on disruptive tech.
Well, that's brilliant. With that note, I think we have to draw to a close the seminar. I don't see any more questions, but I think that it should be around the time to finish up. So thank you so much for your seminar. It's been brilliant. And we hope to see you soon in any other event, or you're always welcome to LSE. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody else. Great to present to you.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you.